Lake Powell is 34 feet away from failure. Right now. Today, this isn't a computer model or some worst-case scenario for a distant future. It's a direct measurement. That's the physical distance between the water's surface and the steel intakes of the Glen Canyon Dam turbines. 34 feet. As of this morning, that's the entire safety margin for the second largest reservoir in the United States. The buffer is gone. The long, slow decline is over. This is the end game. And here's the part nobody's talking about. When those turbines shut down, it isn't just that the lights go out for 5 million people. The water physically stops moving. The river itself, which keeps 40 million Americans alive, gets forced through a set of emergency bypass tubes. Tubes that federal inspectors already found are being torn apart by the very water they're supposed to carry. The dam is eating itself from the inside out. This isn't a story about drought. This is a story about physics. It's about a system built on a lie 100 years ago, now colliding with a reality it was never designed to survive. So what happens when the machine breaks? What happens when America's great desert river stops flowing? Here's the number you need to hold in your head: 3,490 feet. That's the elevation above sea level where the turbines at Glen Canyon Dam stop working. It's called minimum power pull. It sounds like a boring technical phrase, but it actually means catastrophic failure. Below that line, the water pressure is too low and the flow becomes unstable. Air bubbles form and collapse with the force of small explosions. Engineers call it cavitation, and they dread it. It's the sound of solid steel being chewed apart by water and air. It's the sound of a power grid for the entire Southwest beginning to unravel. As of mid-July 2026, Lake Powell's surface sits at 3,524.3 feet, just 34.3 feet above that cliff. The Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency running the dam, already warned that without intervention, the lake could fall below that 3,490-foot line before the end of this year. Not in a decade, this year. To put that in terms you can actually picture, the water is dropping faster than anyone thought possible. Even after a winter with near-average snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, the spring runoff was a disaster. The water that was supposed to refill the system simply vanished. It evaporated straight off the snowfields. It soaked into soil so dry it acted like a sponge. The result was a trickle. Runoff came in at just 15 to 30% of normal. That's not just a bad year. It's a statistical impossibility. It's a signal that the old rules no longer apply. The climate that filled this reservoir for 60 years has been replaced by something else. Something hotter, drier, and hungrier. The dam wasn't built for this. When the water level is healthy, it flows through massive penstocks, spinning 8 enormous turbines and generating the power that keeps the lights on from Phoenix to Denver. But below 3,490 feet, that path is closed. The only way for water to get downstream to Lake Mead, to California, to Arizona, and to Mexico is through 4 smaller concrete pipes near the base of the dam. They're called the river outlet works. They were designed for emergencies and occasional use. They were never engineered to carry the entire flow of the Colorado River for months or years at a time. And they're already failing. Federal inspectors have seen the damage. The same cavitation that destroys steel turbines is eating away at the concrete and steel lining of those bypass tubes. Every gallon that passes through them causes more erosion and more damage, bringing the entire structure closer to a point of failure that the engineers who built it never seriously contemplated. The dam is bleeding, and the water that's supposed to heal it isn't coming. That's the physical reality at Lake Powell right now. It's a crisis measured in inches, unfolding today. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to a different century. Picture a conference room in Santa Fe, New Mexico, on November 24th, 1922. That's the day 7 men, representing 7 states, signed a document that doomed the American West. They called it the Colorado River Compact. It was supposed to be a masterpiece of American engineering and law, a rational plan to divide the water of a great river and build a civilization in the desert. But it was based on a catastrophic math error. The men who wrote the compact looked at the river's flow records and saw a river that was powerful, abundant, and reliable. They measured its average annual flow and came up with a number, around 15 million acre-feet of water per year. If you're wondering, an acre-foot is the amount of water it takes to cover 1 acre of land 1 foot deep, which is about 326,000 gallons. So they took that 15 million acre-feet and they divided it up. They gave 7.5 million to the upper basin states, which are Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico. And they gave 7.5 million to the lower basin, meaning California, Arizona, and Nevada. Later, in 1944, a treaty guaranteed another 1.5 million acre-feet for Mexico. The entire structure of water law in the West, the growth of Los Angeles, the irrigation of 5.5 million acres of farmland, and the very existence of cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas was built on that number, 15 million acre-feet. Here's the part they didn't know. The years they were measuring, the late 1800s and early 1900s, were the wettest period the region had seen in over 500 years. It was a historical anomaly, a freakish, temporary abundance of water that they mistook for a permanent reality. The river's true, long-term average flow isn't 15 million acre-feet. It's closer to 12 or 13 million. And in the last 2 decades of drying out, it's been far less. They wrote a check for an amount of water that the river didn't have in its account. They promised more water than the river has ever consistently delivered. For 100 years, the Southwest has been cashing that check, draining the savings account to cover the difference. That savings account has 2 names, Lake Powell and Lake Mead. These are the 2 largest reservoirs in the United States, built to store surplus water from wet years to survive the dry ones. But the wet years stopped coming, and the dry years never ended. The system now lives in a state of permanent structural deficit. More water is promised by law than is provided by nature. Every single year, the states take out more water than the snow in the mountains puts back in. That isn't a temporary drought. That's bankruptcy. A slow, grinding, century-long bankruptcy, and the accounts are finally empty. Camille Kalimlam Toton knows this better than anyone. As the commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, she's the person ultimately in charge of this failing system. Her job is to enforce the law of the river, that tangled collection of compacts, court decisions, and secret agreements governing every drop. In the summer of 2022, she stood before Congress and delivered a message that sent a shockwave through the West. She told the 7 states they had 60 days to come up with a plan to voluntarily cut their water use by 2 to 4 million acre-feet, which is an unprecedented amount, or the federal government would do it for them. It was a blatant threat. It was a desperate attempt to force a century of comfortable assumptions to collide with the terrifying new math of the river. The states failed to meet that deadline. They've been fighting, negotiating, and suing each other ever since, trapped in a zero-sum game for the last remaining drops of a shrinking supply. Downstream from Glen Canyon Dam, the crisis takes on a different shape. Lake Mead, the nation's largest reservoir held back by the iconic Hoover Dam, is the water source for Las Vegas, Phoenix, and vast agricultural districts in Southern California. Its fate is tied directly to Lake Powell's because water that passes through Glen Canyon Dam eventually ends up here, and Lake Mead is in just as much trouble. As of July 15, 2026, the lake's surface elevation is 1,042. 5 feet. That's nearly 190 feet below full. The famous bathtub ring, that white mineral stain on the canyon walls showing where the water used to be, has become a monument to loss. It's a permanent reminder of a healthier past. For years, the panic number at Lake Mead was 1,050 feet. That was considered the old minimum power pole where Hoover Dam's turbines would struggle. But between 2011 and 2016, the Bureau of Reclamation spent millions upgrading the turbines, retrofitting them to operate at much lower levels. The new power cliff is now 950 feet. It was an engineering marvel that bought them time, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem. It just lowered the floor, allowing the draining to continue. The real doomsday number at Lake Mead is 895 feet. Dead pool. Below that elevation, water physically cannot pass through Hoover Dam's outlet, works by the force of gravity. The river stops. California and Arizona, which receive their water from downstream of the dam, would be completely cut off. It would be the single greatest water catastrophe in American history. It's a scenario so extreme that for decades, people treated it as a theoretical impossibility. Now, it's a line item in federal planning documents. But one city saw this coming. One city refused to let its fate be decided in committee meetings in Washington or by rainfall in Colorado. That city was Las Vegas, and they engineered one hell of an escape hatch. John Jay. Ensminger, the general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, is the man who oversaw the project. He understood the terrifying vulnerability of his city. Las Vegas gets 90% of its water from Lake Mead. For decades, it pulled that water from 2 intake pipes set at different elevations in the lake. The problem was simple. If the lake level dropped below the lowest intake, the city's pumps would start sucking air. The water supply for more than 2 million people and a multi-billion-dollar tourism industry would be gone. So, starting in the 2000s, while other states were still hoping for rain, Las Vegas started drilling. They embarked on one of the most ambitious and expensive municipal water projects in modern history. First came Intake No. 3, completed in 2015. It's a 3-mile tunnel drilled through solid rock, connecting to a new intake structure placed deep in the lake, far below the existing ones. It cost over $850 million. But they knew that wasn't enough. What if the lake dropped below even that 3rd intake? What if it hit dead pool? So they built something else that fundamentally changed the equation. They call it the Low Lake Level Pumping Station, or L3PS. It came online in April of 2020. This wasn't just another intake straw. It's a massive subterranean pump house, carved out of rock deep underground, designed to do one thing: suck water up from the very bottom of Lake Mead, from an elevation below the 895-foot dead pool line, and pump it into the city's water system. The total cost was approximately $1.5 billion. It was a desperate gamble, and it worked. Las Vegas has effectively drought-proofed itself from the physical collapse of Lake Mead. Even if the lake drops to dead pool, and even if Hoover Dam stops releasing water to California and Arizona, the L3PS will keep pumping. The fountains on the Strip will continue to flow. The taps in the suburbs will still run. It's an incredible feat of engineering, but it's also a brutal statement about the new reality on the river. In a system built on shared sacrifice, Las Vegas quietly built its own lifeboat and climbed aboard, while Tom Bushotsky in Arizona and J.B. Hamby in California are locked in bitter negotiations over surface-level cuts. Fighting over inches in the reservoir, Las Vegas is drinking from a private straw drilled into the bedrock beneath them. They've solved their immediate survival problem, but they haven't solved the problem of the river, and the water they're pumping is water that will never reach anyone downstream. The crisis isn't just about a lack of water. It's about a fundamental misunderstanding of how water now moves through the world. For a century, water managers in the West used a simple formula: snowpack equals water. You measure the depth of the snow in the Rocky Mountains in the winter, and you can predict with reasonable accuracy how much water will flow into the rivers in the spring. That formula is now broken. 2 invisible thieves are stealing the water before it ever reaches the river. The first is called sublimation. As warmer, drier air sweeps over the snowfields, it causes the snow to evaporate directly into the atmosphere. It goes from a solid to a gas, skipping the liquid phase entirely. It's water that's there one day and gone the next, turned into vapor before it can melt. Scientists estimate that up to 30 or 40% of the snowpack can be lost this way in dry, windy conditions. It's a massive tax on the water supply, levied by a warmer climate. The second thief is the soil itself. Decades of drought have left the ground parched, cracked, and profoundly thirsty. When the remaining snow does melt, the first thing it encounters is this dried-out soil. The ground soaks it up like a dry sponge, pulling billions of gallons of water deep underground to replenish soil moisture before a single drop can run off into a tributary. The spring of 2026 was the perfect demonstration of this new, broken system. Snowpack in the Rockies was close to average. By the old formula, the reservoir should have seen a healthy inflow. Instead, the combination of sublimation and soil moisture deficit created a hydrological disaster. The runoff was a ghost of what it should have been. The water simply didn't show up. This is the part that should stop you cold. This isn't a temporary condition. Scientists call it aridification, which means a permanent shift to a hotter, drier baseline. The 20th century climate that the entire system was designed for is gone. It isn't coming back. And every forecast, every legal agreement, every crop planting, and every new housing development based on that old reality is now obsolete. The water managers are flying blind, using old maps in a new world, and they're heading directly toward a cliff. That cliff has a date on it, December 31st, 2026. That's the day the 2007 interim guidelines. The current set of rules governing shortages on the river expire. After that, there's no plan. There's no agreement. There's nothing to prevent the system from spiraling into a legal and physical chaos of every state for itself. The pressure to get a deal done is immense. The negotiations have become a brutal, high-stakes poker game. On one side of the table are the lower basin states, led by California's young but formidable negotiator, J.B. Hamby. California holds the oldest and most senior water rights on the river. In a crisis, by law, their supply is the last to be cut. Arizona and Nevada get cut first, and they get cut deepest. On the other side are the upper basin states, represented by figures like Becky Mitchell of Colorado. Their legal argument is simple. They have a right under the 1922 Compact to develop their share of the river's water, much of which they haven't even used yet. They see the lower basin's crisis as a problem of its own making, a result of decades of overconsumption and unsustainable growth in the desert. They refuse to give up their future rights to bail out the past mistakes of Phoenix and Los Angeles. The federal government, led by Commissioner Tootin, is caught in the middle, trying to force a compromise that nobody wants. Inaction isn't an option. The physical reality of the reservoirs will force cuts one way or another. The only question is whether they'll be managed and planned, or chaotic and catastrophic. There have been moments of progress and glimmers of hope. On May 1st, 2026, the three lower basin states did something remarkable. They put aside their infighting and advanced a joint proposal to conserve 3.2 million acre-feet of water through 2028. It was a major step, a recognition that they had to work together to save the system they all depend on. John Ensminger of Las Vegas praised it, saying it moved from ideas to implementation, and J.B. Hamby called it real action to stabilize the water supply. But deep divisions remain with the upper basin. The proposal is a temporary fix, a bandage on a gaping wound. It doesn't solve the long-term problem of the river being legally overallocated. It doesn't create new water. It just manages the scarcity a little more carefully for a few more years. The desperation is becoming purely transactional. On July 15, 2026, another deal was struck. The Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, the massive wholesaler serving 19 million people, agreed to leave 200,000 acre-feet of water in Lake Mead this year. This is water they have a legal right to take. In exchange, the federal government will pay them $325 per acre-foot. That's up to $65 million, paid for by the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. Think about that for a second. The government is now paying the country's biggest water user to not use water. That's what the crisis has come to. We're in a world where the most valuable thing you can do with water is leave it in the lake. It's a sign of how dire the situation has become. The old system of rights and allocations is being bypassed by checkbooks. The water is being bought back, drop by expensive drop, in a frantic effort to keep the levels at Lake Mead from collapsing. But this isn't a solution. It's a series of emergency patches, triage on a dying patient. The fundamental imbalance remains. The water that 40 million people have built their lives upon is disappearing. The snow is vanishing into thin air. The ground is stealing what's left. The reservoirs are draining toward levels that were once unthinkable, and the clock is ticking toward a deadline that could throw the entire American Southwest into a war for water unlike anything the country has ever seen. The numbers from the summer of 2026 tell the whole story. Lake Powell is at 3,524.3 feet, a few dozen feet from becoming a dead dam. Lake Mead is at 1,042, 5 feet, propped up by last-minute payments to keep water in the reservoir. A spring runoff came in at less than a third of normal despite an average snowpack. These aren't statistics, they're vital signs, and they're all flashing red. There was a version of this river that people took for granted, a version where the water was full, the power was cheap, and the idea that it could all run out wasn't something serious people spent time thinking about. Glen Canyon Dam began filling Lake Powell in 1963. It was seen as a triumph, a monument to our ability to tame nature and make the desert bloom. For decades, it held up its end of the deal. It stored water, made power, and created a recreation paradise. That version of the river is gone. It stopped existing sometime in the early 2000s, when the current period of permanent drying took hold and never let go. The lake levels have been moving in one direction since, down. The consequences are no longer abstract, they're real. Just look at the farmers in Arizona's Pinal County, who have already lost their entire supply of Colorado River water and are now leaving fields empty that have been productive for generations. Look at the tribal nations, many of whom hold senior water rights that have never been fully honored, and who now face a future where their paper rights may be worthless because there's no physical water to claim. Think about the 40 million people in cities from Salt Lake to San Diego who turn on the tap every morning and expect water to come out, assuming a system they don't understand will continue to function forever. It won't, not without a fundamental reckoning. We have to recognize that the last century was an anomaly, that the water isn't coming back, and that the entire way of life built in the desert on the promise of abundant water must now be completely reimagined. The fight over the post-2026 guidelines isn't just about water levels in a reservoir. It's about who gets to have a future in the American West, and who doesn't. If you stand at the edge of Lake Mead today at Hoover Dam and look at the waterline stain pressed into the rocks, it sits 186 feet above where the water is right now. That stain isn't ancient history. That's where the water was, within living memory. It's a physical record of everything we've lost. The river is still there, and the dams are still standing. But the system is running on fumes, sustained by emergency measures and billion-dollar bets. It's heading into the most uncertain period in its history, with no safety margin left.